So today I want to show you the shader editor and talk about how Blender manages materials and a little bit of a better way of doing it than this little material panel over on the side. Up at the top, we have a bunch of different layouts. I kind of took you on a tour through it in the first week, but if you come into shading, this is the main view I tend to do a lot of my shading in. What's nice about this is I have several features in here. On the left is a file browser that I can bring files directly in. I'll show you in a second. On the bottom left is like an image viewer that I can look at using this icon or open up images to see what they look like so I can get a sense of what they're going to be visibly looking like. I've got my viewport, and something to know about my viewport here is it's in the third of these three. So this one right here, this viewport shading will always display flat. This second viewport shading, although not quite as high quality as our full lighted render one, will show us what materials and textures look like in sort of a preview sense, but still be very, very fast on our computer and use fewer resources, but it kind of gives us a preview. So when we're previewing textures, we won't use this one because we won't see it there. Now I have these objects here, and I want to create, I've got a couple different objects because I want to show you the same material. Now right now, since there's no material slot, when I select this, there's nothing in here either. This is the same kind of spot. But if I go ahead and I click new, you see it creates a material there and there. I'm going to call this demo underscore MAT, just so I know this is the material for my demo. And I can apply it on all these objects either from here or from here in this same spot. So I can kind of hit it from either of these angles. Now, of course, these slots are how many materials are in here. So if I had more than one material for some reason, I could, like I wanted to blend it onto something, I could add more slots here, and now I'm choosing between slot 1 and slot 2, but I don't want slot 2, so I'm just going to hit minus and get rid of it. Just focus on this demo material. So as you can see in here, it has the same, this little thing here is the same as the settings over here. I can change the color, I can change things like if it's metal or not. I can change what's called specularity, which is sort of the color or highlight on it. But I prefer to usually stick with roughness here, which is like how shiny or harsh is it. There's a whole bunch of other things in here that you can choose different colors, including things like emission, which is like it's emanating with its own glow, but black means it doesn't have any emission at all. And alpha, which I'll talk about a little bit next week. But for now, I want to show you a little bit about what these are and how we can start connecting up pieces. Again, we saw little previews of this, but one of the things you see here is this called material output. This works for either Eevee or Cycles. We're doing most of the stuff in this class in Eevee, but we can switch it either way. And there's also a volume and a displacement setting here. We're not going to really use these right now, probably not in this class. Mostly what we're worried about is surface, which is saying, what does the surface look like? And we see it has a green channel coming in and out, a little green dot. Green means it's bringing in like full material information. Basically, green says it's including like all of this stuff because each of these colors has a different code. Yellow, like you see here, means color. So this base color in here versus something like my normal or my subsurface radius is coming in as 3 numbers. It's called a vector. So this is like an XYZ information. And gray is just a single channel or single linear number ranging, from infinitely small to infinitely large versus something like this purple one are actually 3 numbers. And the one right here, yellow, is actually 4 numbers because it's hue, saturation, value, or it's RGB, and A, which represents an alpha. So it's just like a transparency. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So if I add up and I want to connect up some nodes to something, so say I wanted to have a new color, I want to add a new node. Now everything in here is done via Shift and A. So our Shift and A gives us the actual menu here. Oh, I got to get my node board back on. So get that out of the way. It's the little thing that lets you see my button presses. So Shift plus A brings us this menu, and we have so many different little nodes in here, and I'm going to just show you the ones that we're going to need to worry about the most. So in here, I want to go to color, and we see all these different colors here, like hue, saturation, mix, RGB, color curves. We have inputs, and so like one of these inputs is RGB, and this is literally what it sounds like. We can see it's got RGB values, and it turns into blue, which is my base color. So I can plug this in just by dragging and dropping in here and going into base color. Now there's a really good tool that's an add-on that's included with Blender that you have to turn on that makes all of this stuff much, much easier. And we're gonna go to Edit, Preferences, and we're gonna go into Add-ons. And we wanna make sure in add-ons we are looking for, it's called Node Wrangler. And if you look at Node Wrangler, it has a ton of hotkeys. I only really use a couple of these. I'm not gonna use all of them. I usually one or two. But I'll show you the most crucial ones in here. It's just good to have Node Wrangler on though, because you're going to use it for a lot of things. So I can connect this up. Now I can get rid of this connection here by Alt and right clicking, Control right clicking, my mistake. So Control and right clicking will actually create a little line that I can cut through it, and then I can connect it back up later. So let's talk a little bit then about some of these other nodes. So one of the nodes that I can get in here, if I go into search, is called a vector node. So I have like vector transform, vector rotate, vector math, vector color. There's like so many different like things that work in here. But one of the most important ones that we're going to be using a lot here are the images. But one of the things I want to show you that's really cool is we actually have some interesting textures in here that you can do some stuff with. Like for instance, if I do a, let's see, cloud. Let's find like a nice image, Musgrave, noise. I love all of these. These are really fun to work with. Let's do Voronoi. Voronoi is really cool and it has a lot of neat features. So we see here, this one is red. It's like an input. So red always means a little input. I can also click this little top arrow here to narrow these down. In our space here, middle mouse still pans, and control middle mouse or the mouse wheel will still zoom in and out, which you might need sometimes, but we can't rotate the panel at all. So like shift and middle mouse and regular middle mouse do the same thing because there's no rotating. It's a two-dimensional panel versus this one up here. So we see this one is orange, which usually means some sort of procedural texture. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about this more, but if I take my color from here and put my color in there, we can see it gives me this Voronoi texture that I can change its scale and its randomness. And there's a lot of different settings in here that give me different features. So usually like you can play with different generators and get a lot of interesting effects. Distance to edge is really cool because if I take distance to edge, you see it doesn't have color anymore. I just have a black and white. And I can place it in here. And you see what that gives me is this sort of like edge data. And if I wanted to give this color, I can run it through another node. One of the most important nodes you're going to run into in here that you're going to use a lot because it's a really, really useful utility. Shift A, go to the top, and we're looking for color ramp. Color ramp you might call a gradient. There's a different gradient in here, but it's not the same thing. And what I want to do is put this color ramp in between here and here. And you can see the only input, all inputs, information it can take in is on the left. All information that goes out is on the right. It's a flow, so it always reads left to right. And it can take in a gray input and it can output an orange one or yellow one. So I could take this here and go down and then back up, and it will interrupt that. And at first, it's not going to look like it did anything. But another way I can do is I can just take this and drag it on top of this line, and it'll set it right in the middle. I do this a lot because I create my nodes and I'll put stuff in between. Now what this does is this lets me change the slider on the gradient, and you can see it's like working in like Photoshop with like a curves or working with like a levels node where it lets me kind of refine if I want to make these a little thinner, lighter kind of cracks, or if I want to make these heavier. Now, let's say I actually wanted to give it some color though, because again, it's still pretty bland and it doesn't really have another color. I'm going to duplicate this color ramp for a second off to the side because I know I'm going to need more. But instead of what it's basically saying is like, hey, this is the white input. So what if I change this color of white to something else? Well, this is a map basically that says what is on the left is our black value and what's on the right is our white value. So I can replace these with any color. And so even if I take this color here and I can make this instead something like red, I could really change up the colors because all I'm doing is I'm changing. If I take this and I mute it, M will like ignore it, or I want to do like a pass through. But we can see here, this is the white to black value. And all I'm doing is I'm just adjusting how much of the white to gray is white, and I'm just pushing it forward. I can also, I could go as far as click this little tab and I could flip them and I could invert the relationship. because I'm just deciding it's like left is black and right is white, and it just streams that way. So I can reallocate these colors in any way I want. And in fact, let's take this channel, connect that back up, and I could add a new little hit plus, and I can add a new one in here, and I can make the middle of this range a completely different color. Let's actually make it something really noticeable like green. So we see red is this edge and green is here, and then it's a little hard to pick out, but blue is sort of at that center there because there's a little, like, too much white. And I can string these together too. So I could, duplicate this and add this in, and it's gonna like do these in a sequence where it's actually reversing the relationship of them now. But if I flip that color ramp, I get to sort of like, I can really play with these and mix these together. There's lots of other textures in here that we can do similar things with. So if you just look in this textures tab, it's fun to play with these a little bit. Like some of these that are really fun are like a Musgrave has some really cool stuff because we can just take this height here. And again, if I just took the height into it, like you can see what it's going to give me is like a pretty messy, cloudy kind of thing. And I can up the detail to give it more of a cloudy kind of a look. I can up the number of things like so. So if I actually took this and let's do a duplicate of this color ramp, I could say, all right, let's take this thing here and let's make this red area like a blue-green. And let's make this area, let's take this little tab, I'll slide over. Let's make this one like a peachy color. And let's make this one maybe a little deeper of a green, and then add another one over here. Let's give this one nice, deep, darker green. So I'm kind of creating almost like a little planetoid. And we can see how it's stretched out across all these little surfaces. And then I can come back into this and just change up its scale. So this is the power of, like, we call this is, if you're doing this right now, you're procedurally texturing. There's of course so much more we can mix in with it. But you notice that all of these textures also have this vector input. The vector input is our X, Y, and Z information. And one of the reasons I really love the that node that I was talking about, that node wrangler, is I can click this and hit Control T, and it's automatically going to give me a texture coordinate and mapping node. Texture coordinates is saying, hey, how do I apply in 3D space this 2D thing? And the mapping node is like letting us modify it. We could go straight from here into here, but the mapping node lets us change up the location as well as like our rotation and our scale. It's not doing anything right now because we want to be on UV. This is going from generated, which is meaning it's the whole generated thing. I could set it to object. And actually this is where it's not doing anything because I'm not going to the right guy. Let's go into the Musgrave. So we can see object now. I can change its location and its scale, and I can rotate the textures, and I can scale them in different dimensions to like really start playing with what they can do. And since it's set to world, if I move this object, it's on world object space, not worlds, not global space. But what about this? Let's see what this does. Oh, I have to have like a reference object to do that. But this is the one we're going to use the most is UV space. So that's what we unwrapped it as. And so this is going to be based on what their UVRs are. And you can see their UV seams because it's going to line up almost perfectly with where the seams on these objects are. Generated is going to give us that idea of like it's sort of triplanar, meaning that we're never going to see the seams and it wraps all the way around. And we can change up the scale too. So I could change all these values to the same higher number. But we can make our lives even easier by adding a value in here instead. So I'm going to Shift A, I'm going to search, and I'm going to look for value. And value lets me plug in to all three of these, and it's just going to say now this is my scale factor. And so I can control the scale of its UV size. And so I could take even its UVs and do the same thing here. And even though it's going to have the same seams, I can see that here's the poles for the seams. The plane is nice and flat, and you can see on things like the pyramid, this little cone where we get some seams in there. this is all like I love working with this stuff. I think these are really fun to use. You know, we can plug in and remove stuff. So if I decide I don't want this anymore, Control X, just like it removes a vert and keeps everything else, does the exact same thing. And sometimes it takes a second to update. So one last thing, let's talk about actually bringing in images here. So I'm gonna, you know, kind of clear all this out. Let's just take all of this and we're gonna delete it. And now I want to bring in an image. Now I could just drag and drop it straight in. So I have a little Mega Man. I could just drag it right from my desktop and it will bring it into the scene, which is not a bad way to work. But what's nicer is I like to use this browser and find your folder that you're working with. So mine's on my desktop, which is in my Dropbox. I highly recommend doing that. It actually works really well. It keeps my desktop synced up with everything. And let's see, my 247 folder, wrong guy. Let's say 247 US 21, week 2. I got a couple different Marios here. And what I can do with these now is just drag and drop them in, and you see it brings it in as an image. It's got a bunch of options in here. They're not super important, but let's bring in both of these because I want to show you how they're different. So let's hit Control T, and I can use the same vector for both of these. And I want them to be, I want to make sure they're on UV, which is exactly where they're at, and that's great. And let's take our first Mario right here and plug him into base color. Now you see we have Mario, but he's looking a little thick. This is because all of these spaces expect there to be square. So this first Mario is an up and down kind of texture. Now most textures we're going to use are not only are they square because it's what the computer calculates best, but they're also powers of 2, meaning that they're going to be like at smallest, the thing probably smallest you're ever going to use is something like a 512 by 512. More likely you're going to use a lot of 1024 by 1024. A lot now is in 2048 to the power of 2. Some of it is 4096, and we're just starting, and when we start getting these numbers, we start calling these 1K, and we call this 2K, and we call this 4K, and we're now starting to get into, especially with Unreal Engine 5, some 8K textures, which is pretty cool to see us heading there. But we usually stick with powers of 2 because it starts with that, you know, that 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, then 512. And this powers of 2 are easier for the computer to sort of calculate up. So it tends to, we tend to work in that. Annotations, get rid of these guys. So with this, like I have this other one, and this one is square. And so if I plug this Mario in that square, we can see this Mario is much happier because he's more evenly distributed throughout. And if I want, I can preview the two different ones, and we can see this Mario is nice and square. And we look at our UV editor, we see, again, this mode doesn't show it. We have to be in the second one. We can see in this Mario, the way our UVs are lined up here onto the image versus like this sphere, we see the same thing. It's sort of stretched out and we have these poles at the top. This one, we only see part of it because we have that top and bottom, but I can always take this and move it and just get that stretchy boy Mario. So sometimes playing with these things are a good way of getting a sense of what's actually happening here under my surface. So that's a little introduction to shader nodes. We're going to use these to actually texture our building. I'm very excited about it.